Great, welcome everyone. My name is Stephen Norris. I'm a professor of history here at Miami University. I'm also the director of the Havighurst Center for Russian and Post-Soviet Studies here at Miami. And I'm here to welcome everyone to the first live Q&A of an initiative called Creative Horizons, which is a collaboration between the Havighurst Center here at Miami, Arizona State University's Meilkian Center, headed by Keith Brown, who's on the screen with us, and the Institute on Russia at the University of South Florida, headed by Gulfal Alexopoulos, also here today. Alongside support for faculty and students at their respective universities, all three units share a commitment to promoting greater understanding of Russia and the surrounding region. Building on the separate experiments and virtual programming that have happened to all of us since this spring, this joint venture will give audiences in Arizona, Florida, Ohio, and beyond the opportunity to hear from artists in the region as they discuss their methods, perspectives, and aspirations. This series, Creative Horizons, features videos produced in collaboration by the featured artists and the videographer Ari Gairaj, who's also here today, followed by these online discussions featuring the artists and moderated by people from the three centers. And we're very pleased that the first featured artist is the muralist and graphic reporter Victoria Lomasko, whose 2017 book, Other Russias, which I always keep right here, attracted widespread reviews and attention and won the 2018 Pushkin House Prize for the best book in translation. In 2019, Vika visited the Melikian Center and the Havighurst Center, where she created this mural, Atlases, for Miami University's King Library. And in September 2020, Vika spent time in Minsk, Belarus, covering the extended civic activism protesting the rigged August election results. So we're happy to see you again, Vika, even if virtually by Zoom. And we're very, very happy that you agreed to be the first artist to take part in what we think is a really exciting collaborative digital project. So for the audience out there, the way this will work, I have a series of questions I'll ask Vika. She'll respond. We have the talented Anya Krushelnitskaya to provide some interpretation. Vika will speak mostly in Russian. My questions will only take a few minutes, I hope. I'll show you some of Vika's recent artwork, and then we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. You can raise hands or send a message in chat to David at Melikian, who can call on you. And this whole thing will take half hour, 45 minutes. We want these things to be engaging, relatively short, and not contribute to Zoom fatigue. So I want to start this conversation by asking Vika about the work you've done since completing the mural projects, including the one you see here and the ones featured in the video you produced for this series. And your work has seen a return to the graphic reportage that you did in Other Russias, particularly on Belarus and on the 2020 Russian constitutional referendum that will now allow Putin to remain in power to 2036. So I want to start with Belarus. And to ask you about your impressions about your recent visit to Minsk and your coverage of the ongoing protests there, and particularly about the role of women, which has been highlighted, I think, in the media, and that you've highlighted in your work in these protests. So tell us a little more about your observations in Minsk about Belarusian women and their political opposition.
Okay. The first picture it's about my trip to Belarus. It's for my new comics. It will be published in American issue, The Nip, on the next week. And I want to show how I arrived at Minsk in a trunk in a big bag, because the border between Belarus and Russia is closed. So it was absolutely illegal way. И почему в Беларуси настолько сильно участие женщин в протесте? Наверное, потому что президент Александр Лукашенко совершенно недооценил силу женщин.
Why are the Belarus protests featuring women to such a degree in such numbers? I think it's because the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, grievously underestimated women in general.
Наверное, вы в курсе, что он не допустил до президентских выборов кандидатов мужчин, но позволил участвовать Светлане Тихановской, потому что это же нелепая идея, что женщина вообще может стать президентом.
You may be aware that Lukashenko did not allow male candidates to run for president, but he did allow Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, a woman, thinking that it was such a funny situation that it would not be harmful to him at all.
Please return the previous pictures. For example, here you can see one from woman activist with a symbol of a female resistance in Belarus. И эта девушка сказала мне, что мы используем патриархальные представления Лукашенко о том, что мы нежные и глупые.
The woman pictured here told me that they use Lukashenko's patriarchal mindset to their own advantage because Lukashenko believes women to be weak and silly.
Сначала из-за этих патриархальных стереотипов женщин не так сильно избивали и задерживали на митингах, и они даже пробовали отбивать мужчин, закрывать их своими телами.
For instance, it's due to the patriarchal mindset that originally the police force would not beat the women, they would not attack the women as hard as they did men during the protests, and that's why women were actually able to shield some men from assault.
The next image, please. И когда я приехала в Минск в сентябре, этот рисунок с конкретной женской акцией, на которой случились первые брутальные задержания.
So when I came to Belarus first, this is the first drawing from my first drawing from the first women's act where the first brutal police attacks were seen and detainment.
And you see many women war with their children. I know a lot about police violence from Moscow rallies, but it was in many times dangerous and worse. Я смогла убежать и потом смотрела на видео, как происходили задержания.
I was actually able to run away at the time to leave the scene, and then I watched the videos of all the detaining as it was occurring.
И женщины, никто кроме меня не убежал. Они стояли в цепке, они срывали силовиков балаклавы, и они пытались отбивать своих подруг.
None of the other women except me left the scene. They stayed there. They were busy pulling the headgear off the police force. They held their hands, stood on the chain, and tried to protect their girlfriends, their friends.
So thank you, Vika. Maybe we can turn to your drawings about the Russian constitutional referendum. So you did these drawings about Minsk, and then you did drawings about the Russian constitutional referendum, which were happening more or less simultaneously. And they highlight a seeming return to the 19th century. You mentioned the notion that Russia might be returning to the era of the czars, as well as suggest in these drawings and your coverage of them that time seems frozen, future seems frozen, and the last 20 years have been zeroed out. So maybe you can tell us a little more about these notions and what you mean by them.
Yes, I think here we must show these comics about you said. The Russian constitution was changed. Может быть, вы знаете, что дореволюционная идеология была такая: самодержавие, православие, народность.
You may have heard that in Russia, in a pre-revolutionary time, the state ideology was monarchy, orthodoxy.
Народность.
Steve, what's народность?
Nationality.
Nationality, yes.
Yes. And this moment, our government doesn't have new ideas, new ideology, so they a little bit change the old ideology from 19th century. И теперь это звучит так. Вечный Путин, РПЦ и национализм.
So the new ideology, the new state ideology does not deviate that much from the old one. It's been only changed to Putin forever, Russian Orthodox Church, and nationalism.
Национализм, патриотизм.
Nationalism, which is read as patriotism.
И из-за того, что само правительство ничего не может предложить нам для будущего, оно уничтожает и любые чужие инициативы.
And since the government that we have in power has no future to offer us, as they do, all they do is they eradicate all the initiatives from all other parties.
The second line on this comics with young people is based on my reportage graphics. I want to show it and more tell about new generation in Russia and in post-Soviet space.
And you, in both the Belarusian comics and the ones about the Constitution, you do focus on generational aspects. So you talked about patriarchal aspects of the protests in Belarus, but you also draw on the notion that there are generational differences and generational attitudes at play in both Russia and Belarus today. Being born under Lukashenko or being born under Putin seems to be a new marker of identity. So tell us a little more about how you highlight that and why you highlight it, and what we can understand from this theme that focus on the youth and what you've learned from young people in Russia and in Minsk.
The most part of participants in rallies in Moscow or in Minsk is the new generation. And it's not so important that they have born under Lukashenko or Putin. The most important that they don't know Soviet system. Я объясню это сейчас подробнее. Please return to the previous black-white drawings. One after. This is portrait was made in Minsk. One from feminist activist. Diana, 20-30 years old. And she said, we want to love just as well as our friends to the West, but it's our own country. And it's, I think, the most part, people from the young generation will say it the same. Это, наверное, главное отличие поколения, что они очень сильно ориентированы на западные страны.
The main generational difference, I think, is the new generation looks to the West very much.
The next image, please. And here, the drawing from the void in Moscow, and these two Moscow guys were telling about immigration. Иммиграция – это, конечно, одна из главных тем.
Emigrating from the country is one of the main topics too.
And not only for poor people, for rich also, because I think the most part of people here is not satisfied from our life. The next, please. Очень важно, что в советское время главная идея была такая. Весь мир против нас. Если мы откроем границы, нас уничтожат западные страны, в первую очередь Америка.
It's important to recall the Soviet idea that was prevalent in the Soviet times, seeing the whole world around the USSR as the enemy. And the moment the borders are opened, the USSR was going to be destroyed by the Western influence.
And this drawing from the void to in Moscow. И эти две старые женщины, они говорят, как все их поколение, лишь бы не было войны.
So the two older ladies in the drawing, they just repeat the mantra of their generation. The one thing we care about is there's no war.
И они рады, что Путин выстраивает новый железный занавес, как во время Советского Союза с другими странами, потому что считают, что мы должны просто выживать.
And they are happy that President Putin seems to be is building a new Iron Curtain, a replica of the Cold War Iron Curtain, because they see it as a means of survival for Russia.
А молодые парни, наоборот, думают только о том, чтобы границы России были открыты.
And the younger men in the drawing are of the opposite opinion. The only thing they hope for is for open borders.
И чтобы правительство тратило деньги не на оборону, не на то, чтобы портить наши отношения с другими странами, но на внутреннюю политику.
And for the government spending to be dedicated not to the national defense, not to the military complex, but to make the life of its citizens better.
Короче, новое поколение хочет немедленно хорошо жить здесь и сейчас.
So the new generations, I'd say, want to live well, and they want to live well here and now.
And I think they are right.
So if I could ask maybe one more question, then we'll, I think, open up the floor for the audience. And then if there's still time, I have more. But speaking of the generational changes and the way in which societies are changing that you've spoken about, you described yourself in the video for this series and elsewhere as the last Soviet artist. And your new project is about post-Soviet travels in Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, Georgia, Dagestan, Ingushetia, Belarus, of course, too. So I'm really intrigued by the way you imagine and reimagine historical eras. And I guess my questions for you are, what does it mean to be the last Soviet artist and to conceive of your recent travels as post-Soviet? I'm struck by the fact I direct a Center for Russian and Post-Soviet Studies. Maybe we have to change our name to Russian Post-Soviet and Post-Soviet Studies before the year's out. But if you could speak to the way in which you imagine and reimagine these eras and conceive of yourself in these terms.
Please show the image, this image. I think it's very good an illustration why I'm the last Soviet artist. It's in my town where I have born Serpukhov with my father, who is a Soviet artist decorator. He created a lot Soviet propaganda. And I'm from the last Soviet generation who remember it, the end of Soviet time. And also I have gotten very Soviet art education. This moment it's impossible to get such art education. The next, please. Когда я начала делать проект с поездками по постсоветскому пространству, у меня все-таки была некая ностальгия по советскому времени.
I began working on this project, traveling through the post-Soviet space. I was in part moved by a certain nostalgic feeling for the Soviet Union.
мне хотелось успеть до того, как все это пост-совет распадется, задокументировать то, что еще осталось, сохранить бережно это.
I wanted to document and preserve all of that post-Soviet stuff before it completely falls apart and disappears.
Но после того, как я съездила сейчас в Минск, любая моя ностальгия по советскому прошла раз и навсегда.
But now, after my visit to Minsk, all of my longing for the Soviet Union dissipated forever.
Может быть, вы знаете, что Беларусь считают таким заповедником советского образа жизни.
You may have heard that Belarus is considered to be a kind of a Soviet lifestyle preserve right now.
In Minsk, I was fear every minute that I will be arrested and all my sketchbook will be destroyed. But I wasn't able to scan it, потому что в копицентрах могли донести в полицию.
I was, while in Minsk, I was even afraid that when I was scanning my drawings in the copy centers, somebody could have reported me to the police.
И только один человек из Государственного музея разрешил мне прийти туда, сканировать рисунки.
So there was one person, luckily, who worked for the State Museum in Minsk, who allowed me to come and use their scanner to copy my drawings.
And it was like a real thriller. And I was like a real shy. Меня проверяли, мой паспорт. Это были длинные советские коридоры, где люди подслушивали, подсматривали, кто это идет, может быть, это враг. Это было по-настоящему страшно.
Yeah, it was a real thriller. I had my passport taken and checked. I had to be walked through these long Soviet-style hallways where people kept listening in and looking in. Who's going here? It could be a spy. So I was really scared.
I remember my Soviet childhood, and I understood at this moment I hate it. И, наверное, в этом постсоветском проекте очень важно, это рисунок из советского детского журнала, из моего детства.
Now, here's another important thing about this post-Soviet project. This is the cover of a children's magazine that I remember from my childhood.
И вы видите, что здесь дети из 15 советских республик, и они изображены очень формально, такие просто значки.
So here you see a pretty formal depiction of children who are from all the 15 Soviet republics. They are just symbols of kids, not kids.
И на самом деле, хотя мы жили в Советском Союзе, мы не так-то уж много путешествовали в другие республики. У нас были просто такие формальные представления, что они есть где-то рядом.
And when we lived in the Soviet Union that there was, we did not really travel to the republics that much. We had sort of a formal idea that they existed, they were out there somewhere.
И сейчас я хочу показать, что это не какие-то значки с национальностями, а живые люди со своими историями. The next image, please.
And right now I would like to show that it's not just some symbols of ethnicity that we thought of them as, it's real people with real life stories. Life stories.
So thank you, Vika. I have other questions, but I think maybe now that we're almost a half an hour in here, it would be a time to pause and take questions from the audience if there are any questions. I think David might be able to call on people. I'll keep the screen up here. Comments or questions about to Vika, you can post in the chat.
There's one in the chat from...
Great. Shall I read it?
Yes, please.
Okay. So this is from James Green. Thank you, James. Artists in the modern age often hold the honor of being popular cultural critics, the voice of the people against state or societal oppression. Do you think that your artistry and activism are more important as a voice for the currently oppressed or as a light of justice and reason aimed at helping future generations?
Shall I translate this into Russian?
Yes, please.
Современные художники часто считаются также культурными критиками или голосом народа, который выступает против давления государства или общества. Как вам кажется, вот ваша художественная работа и активизм более важны в качестве голоса угнетенных, скажем так, или в качестве голоса, который выступает за справедливость и разум, которые должны для будущих поколений сыграть какую-то роль? И вообще, стоит ли надеяться на какие-то изменения сейчас, или можно надеяться на изменения только в будущем?
It's a very long question. At the same time, with Belarusian rallies in Kyrgyzstan, also in post-Soviet time, there are presidential elections and rally too. И они сменили власть за один день.
They changed. There was a change in power in Kyrgyzstan, and it took one day to change it.
Поэтому я всегда на это отвечаю: не ждите, что художники сделают вам революцию. Революция делается по-другому.
I always say, don't wait for the artists to create revolutions for you. Revolutions are done differently.
И хотя я показываю документальные истории, которые происходят прямо сейчас, я хочу их рассказывать как такие вечные истории, потому что мы вечно имеем столкновения уязвимых групп и наших правительств.
And although I do tell stories that are visual stories that are documentary about things that are happening right now, what I'm aiming for is to create lasting stories, because there's always oppression from the government. There's always things happening that are like this.
Great. So we have 3 more questions already. I'll read them and Anya can interpret again. So from Anna, I was very moved by your discussion of women's participations in the Belarus protests. Indeed, Belarusian women activists and protesters stand out for their bravery and authentic involvement. I was wondering if you could speak about being a female artist in Russia. And is there a similar phenomenon of Russian female art activism in Russia as there is in Belarus? And why do you think that Russian female artists often prefer to distance themselves from the idea of feminism?
I understand.
Okay.
Steve, please show the image Viva Belarus, not with mother and child, but with line of women. Yeah. The next.
This one?
Maybe here it. Yes.
Yep.
With line with girls. This is a rally, feminist rally in Moscow, near embassy of Belarus, and it continues this moment too. You can see it's also very young girl, yes. Это то, что мы имеем общее, что феминистские группы, сильные феминистские группы состоят из 20-летних женщин.
Here's what we have in common with Belarus. Feminist activist groups, strong feminist activist groups are mostly made up of 20-year-old women.
И к ним присоединяются их друзья-парни тоже.
And their male friends and their boyfriends also join them.
Это очень отличается от того, в чем я участвовала, например, в 2012 году.
There is a big difference between now and the activist rallies that I participated in 2012, for instance.
You know, my generation is really brutal because our time was wild 90, лихие 90-е это было время.
Yeah, we grew up we were young in the wild 90s, the so-called wild 90s.
А это поколение, оно гораздо более спокойное, и оно хочет комфортно жить. Оно хочет спокойных, комфортной, хорошей жизни и уважительного отношения к себе.
So my generation is more, this generation is more sedate and calm, and all they want is to live comfortably and to be respected.
So the next question then from Rachel is to ask, how did you originally get into art and how are the arts promoted today in Russia?
Как вы начали заниматься искусством и как нынче продвигается искусство в России?
You looked at a picture with my father. My dad forced me to be an artist. It wasn't my choice. And I know nothing about how the art promoted in Russia this moment. I think here like in art province, and it's not very interesting for me. Before the pandemic, I was working only in international sphere.
So from Justin, wants to know your opinion about the Russian government's recent re-stigmatization of LGBT people during the recent elections and the propaganda against LGBT adoptions. You do pay attention in your work to feminists and gay rights, so it's something that comes up in your work.
Переводить?
Да, потому что...
Спрашивают вас о вашем отношении, вашем мнении по поводу последних действий российского гражданства в отношении ЛГБТ и стигматизации, подавления прав и так далее. А также пропаганда против усыновления детей ЛГБТ-семьями.
Мне кажется, тот, кто задал вопрос, и так хорошо разбирается в ситуации.
The person who asked the question pretty well probably knows the answer and knows how the situation is working right now.
Of course, I support LGBT community. I did a lot of work about them, for support them. Но был недавно один политический случай, когда хотели посадить в тюрьму девушку, квир-активистку за очень смешные, почти детские рисунки, где, например, была изображена женщина с небритыми подмышками.
So there recently was a curious political case where a young queer activist woman almost went to jail, was sent to prison for her drawings. And her drawings are really, these primitive childlike drawings of things that are even funny, like, for instance, a nude woman with her armpits unshaved.
Там было написано: живые женщины имеют волосы на теле, живые женщины имеют морщины, живые женщины имеют жир. Она была обвинена в производстве порно.
And so the drawings had captions like real life women grow hair in their armpits, real life women have body fat, etc. And for those drawings, she was accused of producing pornography.
That's a natural segue, I think, to the next question from Sarah, which is to ask you about the relative freedom you have to document and show your art. And I guess in a way, Sarah's asking about the way in which you do or don't irritate the Russian state. Do you get noticed in any way that is negative? What's the state of freedom for art in Russia today?
Как вам кажется, у вас достаточно свободы рисовать то, что вы хотите, делать такое искусство, какие вы хотите, или, скажем так, беспокоит вас правительство, государство в этом смысле? Какова ситуация с вашей свободой?
It's a fun question. I lost all my job inside Russia in 2014, and I'm in total isolation here. It's my situation. If you create here something about political topic, maybe in prison, but maybe more lucky, like I am, yes, only in a total isolation.
Which is also, by the way, the subject of Corey's question. I think partly that's the last one, but Matthew has a question here in the chat too, to ask about art activism amongst ethnic groups in Russia and elsewhere. And it's a way of tapping into one of the questions I had for you about your work in Kyrgyzstan, in Armenia, and Dagestan, Ingushetia, about what you see in these places and the role of art in these places, or the role of social activism in these places. So you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Существует ли активизм, художественный активизм или акционизм в отдельных этнических группах, разных этнических группах в России? И Стив спрашивает, вот в Кыргызстане, там, в других местах, где вы путешествовали, какая там ситуация?
Во всех странах, где я путешествовала, есть феминистские группы, но это отдельный разговор про их активизм.
There are active feminist groups in all the states that I traveled through, but that's their activism is sort of a separate topic.
Внутри же России, конечно же, мигранты никаким арт-активизмом не занимаются, потому что они с трудом выживают в очень тяжелых условиях.
If we're talking within the borders of Russia, migrant workers of different ethnicities have no time nor energy to do art activism because they're busy with survival, pretty much.
So I'll ask then Corey's question, which is to expand a little bit more about where you're currently living, and do you feel safe there considering your work? And maybe also, if I could tack on to Corey's question, how the pandemic has affected your work as an artist.
Где вы живете, находитесь ли вы в безопасности, по вашему мнению, а также ваша работа, и как изменилась ваша работа после в условиях пандемии?
Of course, the pandemic is absolutely hard thing for me because I was working in foreign countries. I lost all jobs here. And before the pandemic, I was creating monumental works. I'm adored to work with murals. Now I again return to graphic reportage, and I'm working in small format. During the pandemic, I was drawing a few political events in Moscow, and of course, for me, very important, my trip to Minsk. It was a real adventure.
So thank you. Maybe the last question from Golfo: has the Black Lives Matter movement in the US affected art activism in Russia and maybe even in your own work?
Please, Steve, show my composition with the lozung Black Lives Matter. It's previews. Previews. Yes, here. I'm sure that a lot of people in the post-Soviet space watching closely on American rallies. All my friends follow the говорили, что они делали акции в поддержку Black Lives Matter. И им по-настоящему грустно, что в Америке никто не видит и не слышит ситуацию с Беларусью.
So Vika froze for a moment, so I missed a portion of what she was saying, but I think her friends all had rallies to support BLM, and they conducted rallies to support BLM, and they feel saddened that nobody in the US hears or cares for the situation in Belarus.
We hope that you can change something in the United States and will influence on our countries too.
So we are, I think, mostly at time that we agreed upon. I want to thank everyone for showing up. I want to thank Vika especially for agreeing to this. I want to thank Anya for her translations. We do have a question from Anna in the chat to see the rest of the images, so maybe I'll scroll through them. And if anyone has one last question, they can ask it. If not, we'll take a look at some of Vika's recent work that she's been doing. As she mentioned, it's a return to the graphic reportage that really made her well known in her book Other Russias.
You can see the story about amendment of Russian Constitution in the site The NIP. And on the next week, you can read a new comics about a trip to Minsk.
And remind us where that will be, Vika, next week. Where will it be published?
Maybe Monday, maybe Tuesday, The NIP.
And here are more images that will be appearing. So for those who want to see more from Vika, and we all do, of course, those will be appearing. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, Vika. So nice to see you again. Take care of yourself.